Voilà,
Il sort tout.
et commencer avec les manches dans les
Ah ouais.
vocales.
Gargantua.
Ouais.
Allez, on y va.
Et après 30 minutes, il m'a demandé, mais tu as pas faim?
American actor John Malkovich loves France and speaks French. What can we, as French learners, learn from his French, and how good is it? If you want to find out, keep on watching. Du coup, si vous êtes prêts, allez, c'est parti. Salut tout le monde. For context, the clip that we're using for this breakdown of John Malkovich's French is from an interview where he tells a story about one night spent with Gérard Depardieu, the famous French actor. So, let's take a look at the first clip.
Il est vrai que je suis très ami avec Gérard.
So one of the first things he says is, il est vrai que je suis très ami avec Gérard Depardieu. Now, he says, il est vrai que. Il est vrai que. This is very interesting for us English speakers because if we are learning French and we say it's true that, we often say c'est vrai que. C'est vrai que. But he says, il est vrai que. Now, this is actually, both of them are perfectly acceptable. Both of them pass, right? But it's actually very French to say il est vrai que. And here, il does not refer to he. It is the same as in il y a for there is or there are, or il faut que for you need to. It is an impersonal pronoun. It simply means it. That's its closest translation. So, il est vrai que je suis très ami avec Gérard Depardieu.
Il est vrai que je suis très ami avec Gérard.
So, very good start. He's extremely laid back. Obviously, from a career of being interviewed and being around people, that helps. But doing it in a foreign language, ça reste impressionnant quand même.
Et je me souviens bien une soir quand il est arrivé chez lui.
So the next thing I want to talk about is his first mistake. He says, je me souviens bien une soir. Now, I'm not going to focus on the fact that he says une soir, but it should be un soir. He makes a mistake that a lot of English speakers make, and that is because in English, when we say remember something, that's just what you do. I remember, and then the thing you remember. In French, the verb is se souvenir de quelque chose. So you need that de in there. It's a preposition. So he should have said, je me souviens bien d'un soir. Je me souviens bien d'un soir, because it's de that becomes d apostrophe when followed by a vowel. So d'un soir. Je me souviens bien d'un soir. So first little mistake, not so serious, but one that I hear amongst English speakers a lot. Next up is a little more of a serious one. Once you start getting used to French grammar and using the past tense in particular, you realize that this starts to sound really weird. I don't know about you native French speakers watching this video, let me know down below, but when a foreigner says il a arrivé, for example, il a arrivé, how bad does it sound? Basically, guys, this is wrong because it should be il est arrivé. Il est arrivé. The auxiliary verb, when you use what we call a compound tense, un temps composé in French, some verbs use être as the auxiliary verb. For something like manger or faire, it's avoir. So you say j'ai fait, il a mangé, j'ai mangé. But with some verbs, you have to use être. So it should be il est arrivé. Il est arrivé. And you make that liaison with the T and the A to make it arrivé. Il est arrivé.
Je me souviens bien une soir quand il est arrivé chez lui.
But I think this isn't a mistake that you make if you learn by doing and being immersed. He's studied this and chosen this at some point in his journey and not been corrected. By the way, if you are a French learner who is starting to want to have real conversations, to use that French that's in your head, and you want to make sure that every time you go into a practice conversation with either a tutor or a language exchange partner, you're going to get the most progress and confidence and squash the most errors possible, then I've put together a guidebook and workbook which contains my method for going into these sessions and getting the most out of them. If you're interested in that, check it out after this video from the link down in the description. The next clip, he says something that is perfectly acceptable as far as I know. He says, après 20 minutes. Après 20 minutes. After 20 minutes. We can all understand that.
Et après 20 minutes, quelque chose.
But one thing I've actually started using in 2021, because I find it sort of less of a direct translation and very widely used, and therefore I feel more French saying it, is au bout de 20 minutes. Au bout de 20 minutes. Un bout is the end of something, as in like the end of the table, au bout de la table. But it can also be used for time. So, au bout de 20 minutes. So, après 20 minutes, perfectly fine. But au bout de 20 minutes, if you want to maybe sound a little bit more French.
Et après 20 minutes ou quelque chose, il a souvenir qu'il a une grande bocal de ketchup et une grande truc de moutarde dans le frigo.
Next, we come back to that verb we saw in a previous clip, which was se souvenir de. He gets all sorts of muddled here. He was talking about Gérard Depardieu remembering something, and he says il a souvenu. First of all, se souvenir, the past participle of this verb is souvenu. Souvenu, much like venir and devenir and revenir, and any form of those venir verbs, it's venu. So it's il s'est souvenu. Il s'est souvenu, not il a souvenu. So here is another verb where you need être. Here you can remember this verb needs être because it's a reflexive verb. When it has one of these reflexive pronouns in front of it, this category of verb always requires être as the auxiliary. So in the past tense, it's il s'est souvenu. Il s'est souvenu. Remember, it's de afterwards. So il s'est souvenu de bla bla bla.
Voilà, il a commencé à manger. Et après 20 minutes ou quelque chose, il a souvenir qu'il a une grande bocal de ketchup et une grande truc de moutarde dans le frigo.
So that one was all kinds of mixed up because of avoir in the auxiliary and souvenir, the wrong past form. Next, though, I want to praise him for knowing such a specific piece of vocabulary as un bocal. Un bocal. Maybe it's just me, but as French learners with interests in different areas, we all know random vocabulary that other people at our level, approximate level, don't know. He knows un bocal, which is a jar, like un bocal de pâte, un bocal de biscuit, for example, like a biscuit jar, cookie jar, un bocal. So that's pretty cool that he knows some specific language, un bocal de ketchup, I think he says. But then immediately after he says un truc de moutarde, un truc de moutarde. I like this as well. I'm a big fan of this. I tell all my coaching students to use the word truc. Truc means a thing, so it's very generic. It's much more common than saying une chose. The French say un truc. And I tell my students to use this because as foreigners, we have much more limited vocabularies than natives. So when we inevitably get stuck on a word, we need to be able to have the confidence to use the most generic word possible and then go and describe what is blocking us. So un truc de moutarde. So really good use of that from him here. Really happy with that. And also should be remembered that it's not just something that a learner has to say. Natives say it all the time when they're lazy or in the moment they can't think of the word to say. They say un truc. Ensuite, he says something that clearly comes from his experience and exposure in the language, not just translating word for word, otherwise you wouldn't get there. He says à ce moment-là. À ce moment-là, which means at that time, or it can also mean at this time, but you know from context which one you're going for. So one French term for two English terms. Pretty good. At that time. À ce moment-là. If you translated word for word, you might come up with something close to à ce moment, but not à ce moment-là. The French need this là to go a bit more specific and emphasize the moment that they're talking about. So they say à ce moment-là. So he's probably heard that a bunch of times and just started using it, which is a great tactic to use.
Et commencer avec les manches dans les vocales.
Gargantua. Allez, on y va.
Et après 30 minutes, il m'a demandé, mais tu as pas faim? J'ai lui dit, honnêtement, à ce moment-là, pas trop.
But then he goes back to sort of making a really sort of basic grammar error, which I know a lot of you out there struggle with the passé composé in particular. Now, when you're saying, I say to him, you say, je lui dis. Je lui dis, right? In the past tense, I said is j'ai dit. J'ai dit. But when you need to put the pronoun, i.e. for him, in this case, lui, you mustn't put it between the verbs. You have to put it before all the verbs. Je lui ai dit. Je lui ai dit. And he says, j'ai lui dit. J'ai lui dit.
J'ai lui dit, honnêtement, à ce moment-là, pas trop.
Now, I thought at first, no, he can't have said that. But I kept listening and I heard it further ahead in the interview and I was convinced that's what he's saying. So it's another bad habit that he's picked up and no one's corrected him. But then when he's saying how he wasn't particularly hungry, he says pas trop. Non, pas trop. J'avais pas trop faim. j'avais pas trop faim. Very French. In English, we typically say very, so we would maybe translate with très, j'ai pas très faim, which is also acceptable, but it's really French to say trop instead, which literally translates to too much or too hungry. But the French use it way more than très. So, pas trop, he said, pas trop. So, points for that, really like that.
Il a commencé d'entrer sens interdit.
Il a pris un sens interdit.
Il a arrêté chaque voiture et il a commencé à demander l'adresse de Johnny. Mais n'inquiétez pas, par cette méthode, il a eu l'adresse de Johnny en moins que 5 minutes.
And then he's talking about how Gérard took him on his fuchsia-coloured scooter in the middle of Paris to look for Johnny Halliday's house, and he forgot halfway through the journey that he'd forgotten the address. So he started asking random strangers where his address was, and he got it in 5 minutes. John Malkovich says, "N'inquiétez pas." Basically, n'inquiétez pas, don't worry, he got the address. N'inquiétez pas. But this is strange because it's missing a key part of that phrase. And it's vous. You have to say ne vous inquiétez pas. Ne vous inquiétez pas. And that is because the verb is s'inquiéter. S'inquiéter, you need that, it's reflexive again, so s'inquiéter. So when you're using it in the vous form, you have to say ne vous inquiétez pas. In terms of giving an order, he's using this imperative voice. He's saying like, don't worry, that's the imperative. He's saying ne vous inquiétez pas. If you're using it with tu, you say ne t'inquiète pas. Ne t'inquiète pas.
Par cette méthode, il a eu l'adresse de Johnny en moins que 5 minutes.
And then one thing that I liked is very French. It's not something that I easily picked up when I was learning this. Was he said il a eu l'adresse. Il a eu l'adresse. Now, literally, kind of makes sense. It says he had the address, but it's the best way of saying he got the address. He got the address. The French don't have this very versatile verb that we have in English of to get, because it means various different things, and it's a nightmare for French people to learn English, to get confident with get. So to say that in this context, to obtain something, which is one way you could say it, he could have said il a obtenu l'adresse, but he said il a eu l'adresse, which is perfect French. Il a eu l'adresse. So again, speaks to how he's clearly spent time in the language. Got a lot of things that he needs to iron out that have become bad habits, which untreated, they'll probably just stay forever at his stage of comfort with the language, and the fact that he clearly has French friends and just thinks of it as like a second home. That's a really nice way to express that idea. Alors, that is my décortiquage of the French of John Malkovich from this one clip. What do you think of his French? What score out of 20 would you give him? I would honestly say I'm going to give him a 10. And my reason for that is, yes, he's very comfortable and he communicates, which is the main thing, but he makes some very, what I would consider uncomfortable errors to hear that I would expect someone who has been speaking for as long as he clearly has to have ironed out. What score would you give him? You're going to have your own criteria. I think communication is extremely important, but getting to a certain stage of the grammar to make it pleasant for other speakers to listen to you is very crucial as well. So what would you give John Malkovich? Let me know, and others, down in the comments below. And remember, if you are a French learner who is starting to want to have French conversations, or you're already speaking but you feel like you're not making the most of your opportunities when you do speak and you're still making tons of errors, check out my workbook linked down in the description. That's it for this video, tout le monde. If you enjoyed it, please don't hesitate to hit the like button underneath the video. It really helps me out. But I will see you on the channel next week for another breakdown of someone speaking French. À la prochaine. Ciao.